Like the majority of the gaming world, I've had my fair share of fun with Vampire Survivors and a handful of its competitors, imitators, and peers. While that game helped spawn a genre that at this point is severely oversaturated, it also provided a template that's ripe for innovation, which is why I'm always keeping an eye out for games that take the Survivors-like formula and do something new with it. And while there are a handful of new titles that truly make an honest effort to experiment with and expand the genre, the vast majority of the games we've seen capitalizing on this trend offer little more than a new setting or a slight tweak to the same gameplay mechanics. Well, I'm happy to report that Pest Apocalypse, the sophomore effort from Kikimora Games, is much more than just a fresh coat of paint. It's a deviation, combination, and experimentation that combines aspects from multiple games, thoughtfully implements the fun parts of each, and pulls it all together with a wacky art style and aesthetic that feels fresh in more ways than one. In fact, it's pretty safe to say that this might just be your next Survivors-like addiction. Nah, man, I don't know. That's a problem for your gaming addict ass. Okay, so let's break this down in the simplest way possible. The quickest description of Pest Apocalypse you'll get is that it's like a combination of Vampire Survivors and Crazy Taxi, which is true, and also an awesome concept, but that comparison would also be selling this game short quite a bit. Pest Apocalypse has you playing as a pizza delivery driver tasked with hauling fresh hot pizza pies to customers all over a post-apocalyptic world that's been overtaken by various pests, rodents, and other weird mutated monsters trying to get in the way of you and your job. Along the way, you'll pick up various passengers that assist you in destroying the hordes of enemies you'll encounter using their zany and varied abilities that serve the role of weapons or attacks found in other games. And of course, you're not out there delivering pizzas on foot. Instead, you're cruising around in one of several vehicles that can boost, jump, and drift around the environment, avoiding monsters, or running into them on the way to your next customer. It makes for a deliberately unruly control scheme that can feel a bit reckless in the best way possible, as you accidentally smash into a wave of enemies or narrowly thread the needle between a couple of abandoned buildings while one of your passengers drops bombs from the drones they have circling your delivery van. Figuring out when to use your nitro boost, when to jump over parts of the terrain, and when to drift through and around groups of enemies is part of the strategy you'll slowly master over many runs through the game's levels. Speaking of, these aren't the flat, strictly top-down maps we traditionally see in games of this genre. Though your viewpoint is still fixed, all of the landscapes in Pest Apocalypse are very much three-dimensional, and their irregular, unpredictable terrain is a big part of what makes traversing them so much fun. There are points where you'll need to choose whether to avoid an overly steep hill in your path or use some of your precious nitro to boost up it more quickly. There are times when you can use a seemingly subtle bump in the landscape to send your vehicle flying over enemies below you. There are gimmicks like tornadoes that swoop you up into a cyclone, or fast-track rails that are more at home in a skateboarding game. And of course, there are ramps placed throughout the levels that you can strategically use for a quick getaway, or just for a stylish aerial slow-mo shot because hell yeah. And while these twists on some of the more overplayed genre movement mechanics and level design certainly play a large role in making Pest Apocalypse stand out from its competitors, they're not the main element that makes the game feel like a truly different recipe. That achievement falls on the shoulders of your primary objective during runs, which is not to kill enemies, it's to deliver pizza. It's here where the Crazy Taxi comparison comes into play, because as the game's Steam page description says, there's more to this than just surviving. You have a job to do. Runs in Pest Apocalypse are time-bound. You can't finish them and exit the level until the timer runs out, no matter how many pizzas you deliver or how many enemies you kill. But delivering pizzas is the main mechanic used to acquire the upgrades and power-ups that are essential to surviving long enough for that timer to hit 0. Upgrades in Pest Apocalypse are presented in a few different ways. Of course, there's the now standard roguelike structure of both temporary upgrades gained during and limited to individual runs, as well as permanent upgrades that can be purchased between runs with the sweet tip money you collect from delivering pizzas. But in Pest Apocalypse, that second category consists of two distinct tranches. When you deliver a hot pizza on time, you're given your choice of primary upgrades, which could either be adding a new passenger or improving a universal stat like decreasing ability cooldowns or gaining more nitro for your vehicle's speed boost. This form of upgrade is essentially what you're used to seeing each time you gain a level in games like Vampire Survivors or its many iterations. The first deviation here is that these upgrades are not provided every time you gain a level from collecting experience orbs from fallen enemies, but rather only when you deliver a pizza on time. Gaining XP and levels instead gives you what are essentially upgrade points in the form of these little wrenches, and you can use these points to upgrade the passengers you're carrying through their skill paths, allocating them to any path on any passenger. And you can only allocate points upon completing a delivery. But you can also be late in your deliveries, which means the pizza arrives to the customer cold. When this happens, you can still allocate upgrade points, but you don't get to select a new general upgrade. This creates an interesting scenario of choice, asking the player to decide if they want to spend the delivery time eliminating more enemies and in turn gaining more wrenches to upgrade existing skills at the risk of arriving late, delivering a cold pizza, and foregoing the opportunity to gain a brand new power-up. So although completing deliveries is the primary goal of each run in Pest Apocalypse, the player is still incentivized to take the time to defeat enemies and collect XP, in which case they of course also risk getting hit and damaging their vehicle more and more. The delivery mechanic also addresses one of the main downfalls of a game like Vampire Survivors, which doesn't strongly incentivize you to move around the map other than just to avoid enemies. This is a component of the genre that others have taken a crack at remedying, like the more objective-based gameplay found in Deep Rock Galactic Survivors. By scattering both pickup and delivery points all across the map and incentivizing you to complete deliveries on time, Pest Apocalypse finds its own solution to this problem, and in the process rewards the player for becoming familiar with the layout of each level and knowing the best paths between each point of interest. There's a lot of clever interactions here that just make this gameplay feel really well thought out, and certainly something much more than a simple cash grab or clone in a genre that's full of them. Pest Apocalypse is also a game that understands how steering hard into a theme and centering every slice of the game around that theme can really make a difference in the player experience. We've seen similar attempts at this, particularly in this genre, where seemingly every new game announced angles itself as Vampire Survivors in space, or Vampire Survivors with guns, or Vampire Survivors, but it's set during the French Revolution, and all of your upgrades are based on bourgeoisie fashion pieces like an oversized bonnet that fires ostrich feathers, and an extravagant ruffled shirt that emits waves of poisonous perfume. That one doesn't exist? That one should exist. For most of these games, however, their spin on the formula is little more than window dressing. Dig a bit deeper and you'll find they're still all pretty much the same game, sporting a new outfit. And Pest Apocalypse does this too, to an extent. Its passenger system brings a unique presentation to gaining new attacks and abilities that fit the theme of the game, but functionally this isn't any different than gaining a new weapon or item in other titles. Your choice of passengers primarily just determine which attacks you'll add to your arsenal. But this is just one of many thematic choices that work in unison to flesh out the game's world and premise. And Pest Apocalypse brings so many of these small touches together in such a well-directed package, the impact of them is felt much more than it is in other games that don't buy into their own theme as much as this one does. It feels funny to use the term role-playing in a bullet heaven roguelike, but pretty much everything Pest Apocalypse does, both stylistically and structurally, helps to serve the player's role of acting as a pizza delivery driver in a wacky post-apocalyptic world. The passenger system isn't presented as some kind of unique mechanic, but rather just as a fun way to explain different attacks available to you. Most passengers are caricatures representing the abilities they unlock, like Toxico, who sprays a trail of poisonous pink gas behind your vehicle, or the Ice Queen, whose giant icicle projectiles can freeze enemies caught in their path. These characters aren't even visible in-game, but each one still manages to have their own personality thanks to their stylishly designed portraits and humorous flavor text. When a passenger becomes fully upgraded and you pair it with the correct synergy item, they don't just give you a statistical boost in power, they transform into a whole new over-the-top character. So the aforementioned Ice Queen turns into the Karaoke Queen, and Steve, your run-of-the-mill basement-dwelling pizza lover, becomes Steve, but grungier. This is just one seemingly inconsequential detail that again plays no role in functionally changing the game, but gives it an unmistakable personality that's missing from so many of its competitors. And this is yet another thing this game does really well. It's fucking funny. Obviously, there's not a whole lot of reading you need to do in a game like this, but Pest Apocalypse really maximizes the limited opportunities it has in this area to make a genuinely humorous impact. Item summaries have spice and wit. Your boss who pops up to congratulate you after deliveries has some fun referential one-liners, and level descriptions care just as much about getting a chuckle out of you as they do actually detailing the features of the environment. This irreverent presentation from the game's writing is paired with gameplay that's often humorous itself, both intentionally and sometimes not. Controls of your vehicle are tight, but the physics system is tuned to be just exaggerated enough that sometimes accidental moments like bouncing off a giant mushroom and soaring halfway across the level feel amusing rather than frustrating. As another example, in general, the game discourages you from just running over every enemy you see, as you'll quickly lose health that way. So the instances when you pick up a power-up that allows you to freely ram into everything head-on are all but guaranteed to put a smile on your face. It's gameplay that feels active and alive and a little bit nutty, resulting in an experience that's quite a bit more engaging than the sometimes mindless action that other survivors likes fall back on. The game's soundtrack also plays its part to keep you feeling good, with its upbeat drum and bass tracks reminiscent of the kind of music you'd find in a game like 1080 Snowboarding from back in the day. And while its disappointingly small roster of songs means you'll be hearing all of them a bit too frequently, everything that's here is catchy, and there's literally a high-energy earworm called Step on the Gas, so they get a bit of a pass there in my book. Of course, we can't talk about the presentation of Pest Apocalypse without highlighting the game's fantastic art direction that pulls several stylish elements together, creating a visual impression that's overflowing with liveliness. In this game, your character and the environment exist in one graphical world, and the enemies exist in another, combining both 3D and 2D models in a way that meshes surprisingly well. That fusion is made possible because of the commitment to the game's funky design aesthetic that's consistent across visual components despite their sometimes clashing infrastructure. And it's not just what you see in-game. The consistency carries over to the UI, menus, logos, portraits, and every other piece of the game's visual design. Basically, watching Pest Apocalypse is kind of like browsing a modern art museum and admiring the pieces that combine multiple mediums into one illogically cohesive expression of the artist's vision. The game achieves a level of attention to detail that a lot of Survivor's imitators either don't grasp or frankly just don't put the effort into. A lot of those games cut corners in their presentation because they don't perceive it to be a feature that's important enough to drive the experience. But as soon as you see what a game like Pest Apocalypse accomplishes with its visuals, its sound, its cohesive direction, it's not hard to see that most of its competitors are severely lagging behind in this area. So this game just does a lot of things right, and it also does a lot to feel unique compared to the sea of Survivors likes that have flooded the market over the past couple years. But it also has a few flaws that I think could unfortunately turn some players away from giving it a fair shot as their next go-to bullet heaven title. The main barrier I experienced is the fact that the early game can be a bit of a slog. Permanent progression is slow and not impactful enough to feel like you're really making much headway for quite a while. Each level of purchasable upgrades like increased damage or health regeneration provide only very small increments in exchange for quickly increasing amounts of cash that can take a long time to stockpile. This hits particularly hard when it comes to opportunities for healing, which in Pest Apocalypse are a combination of not frequent enough and not potent enough, making your demise in many runs simply feel like an inevitability. The game actually provides several methods for healing, which again feels like thoughtful design, but that only makes it all the more disappointing when you realize their validity as a mechanic is fickle at best, at least in the early game. Each one of these methods, from health drops to permanent regen to a passenger that gives you a lifesteal ability, simply provide a negligible amount of healing, even if you heavily invest into them. In similar fashion, you'll feel this same sluggish progression with your vehicle's nitro boost, as you start the game with a minuscule amount of this resource, and the baseline regeneration of it is painfully slow. This wouldn't really be so bad if your nitro was simply a nice bonus to have, but in the framework of Pest Apocalypse's gameplay, nitro is a crucial component to your moveset, as any honest attempt to make your jump ability a useful mechanic is pretty much gated behind your ability to speed boost. The problem that these issues actually cause is that because the turbulent, vehicle-based movement used in Pest Apocalypse naturally causes you to tank quite a bit of damage as you run over enemies, intentionally or not, many runs end up feeling like a war of attrition that you don't have a reliable method to win. As your health slowly gets whittled down and you have no consistent movement abilities to avoid or escape damage, oftentimes you know you're not going to finish the run long before it's over, which I don't have to tell you is not a great feeling. This issue, combined with the slow overall progression, means that you'll likely be replaying the first couple of levels for a while before really feeling like you've gained any momentum and start unlocking new content. And that's a shame because the additional biomes and their sub-levels all provide individually fun experiences. experiences, each one containing a unique layout and/or special gimmick that results in a lot more gameplay variety than what we're used to seeing in this genre. You'll likely also experience some physics problems where your vehicle just kind of stops operating the way it's supposed to. And as with pretty much any game of this type, it definitely ignores true balance as far as abilities go, as you're almost required to choose at least one of a few select passengers to help you carry a successful run. Oh, I also ran into a couple bugs where my car got stuck inside the terrain, or in one case, fell completely through the bottom of the map, causing an eternal freefall into the true apocalypse that is out of bounds gaming voids. To be clear, I don't think these issues with any initial progression or janky gameplay should prevent you from trying this game out. And if you do run into the same frustrations during the early hours, I'd encourage you to stick with it, because eventually this game can provide the same ridiculous build-based power fantasy this genre is so well known for, in some environments that are pretty unique and scenarios that are a lot of fun. Pest Apocalypse feels like the shot of adrenaline that this style of game has needed for a while now. I wouldn't say it's anything like an evolution of the reliable format we've become accustomed to, but rather a sharp deviation from it, one that introduces new movement, new mechanics, and new design, and packages it all together with a presentation that's one of the most stylish and refreshing you'll see all year. Its increased complexity and controls, and in turn demand for more focused attention, means that it doesn't really fall into the category of those more relaxed Survivors games. So it's not something that's going to replace a game like Vampire Survivors in your catalog. But if you want to see what a creative, thoughtful, and risk-taking developer can achieve with that formula, I'd highly recommend you check out Pest Apocalypse. It's goofy, it's well thought out, and it allows you to sit back and enjoy some entertainingly hectic moments that maybe you haven't felt since the days of giving passengers taxi rides around the vibrant streets of the Bay Area. I'll leave a link to its Steam page in the description below, and if you enjoyed this video, leave a comment with the name of any other weird, wacky, or wonderfully off-the-wall games you think I should try out in the future.